I'm Labuschagne from African Parks. I'm the Director for Conservation Development, and I'm just going to give a short overview of African Parks as an organization, but also provide an overview of what we believe is a pragmatic roadmap to achieving conservation at scale using sustainable management of protected areas as the sort of core concept. So African Parks was founded 20 years ago in response to the decline in protected areas as a result of a lack of financial and technical resources. We pioneered the concept of public-private partnerships as a conservation solution in Africa. And the model is essentially based on the separation of responsibilities, which ensures accountability. So government remains the owner of the natural asset and sets the policy and legislation, and we as the private partner are responsible for the execution of the day-to-day management on the ground within a defined framework. And we look, sorry, I'm just going to close the window. Lots of birds. We look at that in what we call the 3 M's. So the first is the mandate with government, which is incredibly important, and that is normally 20 years or longer. Then the application of best practice management principles, and then of course the money to protect these areas. So currently our portfolio is 19 protected areas, which we are managing in partnership with 11 different governments, covering an area of about 14.7 million hectares. Around 3,400 permanent employees, 96% of which are coming from the local regions around the park. And then we also have 3 incubator partners, which are organizations that we have partnered with to mentor them. We help them with the standard procedures that we've developed, the systems that we use, so that they can then manage areas within the same model as ourselves. So if we look at the sort of what the science is saying in terms of the 30% that we need to put aside for nature to essentially ensure our sustainability and that of the species that we share planet Earth with, we as African Parks look at the unit by which we can achieve that as being the protected area. Because natural resources have value, especially within the current socio-political context, the increasing human population, a legislative underlay upon which management can be applied is incredibly important. But what we also see is that what is not being managed sustainably is also very likely going to be lost. And if we look at an example, this is a satellite image of the WAP complex. Many on this call will probably be familiar with this image, and you can really see the outline of the network of protected areas. If you overlay that with the human population layer, so this is Facebook's human settlement layer, which is one of the most accurate data layers, that image becomes all the more real. And then this is what it looks like on the ground in many of the boundaries of that protected area network. So at that macro conservation picture, it's still not looking very good. With a vision of 30% to be put aside for nature, Africa currently only has 15% gazetted as protected areas. But many of those are actually paper parks. So they don't actually exist in practice because of severe habitat loss as a result of various reasons, agriculture, development, etc. Many of them are also too small to be really sustainable and resilient in the long term. So with finite technical and financial resources that we all have, we need to find a way of focusing conservation management where it will have maximum impact and then building off of that into the larger landscapes. So bringing it down to something that is more manageable that we can then expand upon. And what we at African Parks really believe is getting those foundations right. But there are a couple of key principles that are important with that. Firstly, it is more cost effective to conserve intact nature than it is to restore it. That doesn't mean one cannot restore it, but it does take a lot more effort and financial resources. Secondly, scale and connectivity is incredibly important if one is looking at resiliency in a changing climate, changing socio-political context, and especially in the kind of semi-arid regions. Size is really important. And then the strength of the legislation and the management is really crucial for sustainability. So a little bit like the key landscapes for conservation that Philippe mentioned earlier, African Parks recently conducted a high-level analysis looking at what we believe the network of anchor protected areas are in Africa, which are at scale and relatively intact. So we didn't look at a landscape level, but we went down to the individual legislated protected area level. And then using the concept of building off success, which is a principle which we have adopted at African Parks, prove the concept and then grow from that. And just in practice, that is looking at management of protected areas. If we have one protected area in the country and that has worked well and government is happy and the communities that we partner with are happy, then we can move into other areas in that country. It could also mean getting a core protected area right and then starting to manage the adjacent protected areas like we've done with Sinyaka Mania near Zakuma National Park. But it's also working with partners to secure broader landscapes, which are often transboundary, such as the WAP complex in Benin, Burkina Faso, and Niger. So it's using the anchor concept, but also then building off of success. So if we look at just a couple of examples, the left-hand picture here are a number of the areas on the 161 core list that we defined. These are managed by a combination of ourselves. Wildlife Conservation Society is managing some of these areas, FFI, AWF. It's a number of different players, communities, governments involved. If one can get those well managed and then move into the adjacent protected areas, which is the middle picture, and finally start to conduct proper land use planning and restoration in the buffer zones around these areas, one can see how building off of the anchor list or anchor areas, one can start moving to these enormous landscapes, but it started with a manageable approach and then grown into something that starts to have real scale at a global level. But this requires multiple governments, organizations, donors, communities to really fully achieve this in practice. Another example is the WAP complex in Benin, Burkina Faso, and Niger. So African Parks started managing Penjari National Park in Benin in partnership with the Benin government. We've then started last year, took on the management of W National Park, and are now working with Wild Africa Conservation, which is one of our incubator partners in W Niger, and then looking at management solutions for the Burkina Faso component, which at the moment, as Philippe said, is suffering enormous pressures from an insecurity perspective. But if one can start to achieve this with multiple partners, multiple donors, multiple governments, one can start to really look at securing this entire ecosystem with effective management and in a harmonized approach. But again, using the anchor areas as that building block or foundation. And then just before I end off, legislation is one thing, management is another, but for these areas to really truly be sustainable in the long term, one has to work towards ecological, social, and financial stability. So we look at that as the three-legged stool. If one of those legs is not there, the stool will fall over. And so management must be done in a holistic way. And at African Parks, we call it the 5 pillars of our implementation, which is infrastructure and management, tourism, community development, biodiversity conservation, and law enforcement. And if those are holistically implemented, then one hopes that these areas can really be sustainable on all 3 levels into the future and really provide engines of change in these landscapes. I hope that wasn't too long. Thank you.